For Chapter 11, The Peculiar Institution, we're going to be looking at slavery in antebellum America. And when I say antebellum, I'm referring generally to what period 4 is. The antebellum period, or the antebellum America, is referring to the early 1800s before the Civil War. And antebellum actually means before the war, and in this case they're referring to the Civil War. So here we're going to be looking at antebellum slavery, the society of the South, and the centrality of slavery to that Southern society in the years before the Civil War. Essential question 1 is, how did slavery shape social and economic relations in the Old South? Like I've said in a previous chapter, cotton was king in the South, and Southern cotton accounted for 3/4 of the world's cotton supply. So 3/4 of all the cotton that's supplied to textile manufacturers in the North and all over the world is coming from the South. And in fact, Southern cotton exports outstripped all other U.S. exports combined. Now, while the transatlantic slave trade had been abolished in 1808, a vibrant internal slave trade still existed in the United States. Most of that trade was shipping slaves further and further south to the lower South, which would have been the main area of cotton production. The Southern economy overall was certainly more agrarian and rural than was the Northern or even Midwestern economy. The South did not share in the industrial and urban growth of the market revolution, and in fact, it produced less than 10% of the nation's manufactured goods. It also had fewer railroads and fewer canals as well. Even though we tend to think of the antebellum South as all large plantations, big white columned mansions, and hundreds of slaves in the field, that's really not true for the vast majority of white Southerners. Most Southern whites, in fact, about 75% of Southern whites were what we call yeoman farmers, who either didn't own slaves and in most cases could not afford to own slaves. But yeoman farmers were small subsistence farmers, meaning that they grew enough agricultural products for themselves and their families with maybe a bit extra to sell at market. But they were certainly not large plantation owners, and they weren't even really commercial farmers. So if most of the South were yeoman farmers, it's actually this very small minority of very wealthy planters who dominated Southern political, social, and economic life. And when I say wealthy planters, I'm referring to planters who owned these large plantations and who owned at least 20 slaves. They were a dominant elite in the South. They ran government, they ran society. They really were a sort of aristocracy without the titles. So nonetheless, despite this dramatic divide in wealth and class between yeoman farmers, which made up most whites in the South, and that small elite group of planters, these two groups were united by their race of being white rather than by their class, which is why many yeoman farmers will support the institution of slavery even though they don't own slaves themselves. Now, those that did own slaves, on the other hand, practiced a kind of paternalism towards slaves. And by that I mean slave owners tended to portray themselves as caretakers of what were like childlike slaves in their view. They were kind of like parents in the sense that they felt that they provided food and shelter, clothing, indoctrination into Christian religion, etc. And they like to use this image to portray themselves in a beneficial manner, especially when they would typically contrast this with what they called wage slavery of northern industry, whereas northern industrialists would only provide their workers a small wage. On the other hand, southern slave owners saw themselves as providing much, much more in a more warm, personal way to their workers. Slave owners also justified their use of slavery in many other ways as well. First and foremost was justifying slavery based on racism, alleging that African Americans were a separate race from whites and were actually inferior. Southern slave owners also justified their use of slavery through biblical passages that justified the use of slavery. And they also pointed to the ancient Greeks and Romans who practiced slavery as well, although the form of slavery practiced in the Greco-Roman world would be much, much different than African slavery, but nonetheless. A final justification is kind of interesting in that the Southern slave owners justified slavery with the idea that it guaranteed equality for whites by having a permanent underclass of coerced labor to do those lowest paying jobs. And the idea being that if slaves were freed, then they would compete with whites for, say, industrial jobs or agricultural labor jobs, and thus kind of force away a sense of equality among whites that frankly didn't really exist, but this justification did nonetheless exist.